In the dead of night, as a storm ripped across the frontier, a lone rancher did something no one in the territory would ever forget. He opened his door to two starving sisters, strangers, trembling, half-frozen, but when dawn finally broke, the ground began to shake. Their father had returned for them, and he wasn't alone. An entire tribe, hundreds strong, rode straight toward the ranch, and what happened next would change every life on that prairie forever. The sky tore open with a jagged crack of lightning, slicing the valley in two, illuminating a world drenched in gray and green. Rain pounded the earth, hammering against the lone cabin where he trudged, boots sinking into mud thick as clay. Each step was a battle, water clawing at his heels, wind slicing through the soaked coat clinging to his back. The smell of wet pine, ire, rich soil, and the faint tang of smoke from the dying hearth mingled into a sharp, biting perfume of survival. He saw them then, two figures curled beneath the shattered frame of an overturned wagon. Small, shivering, and hollow-eyed, their ribs pressed against sodden clothing, faces streaked with dirt and rain. The storm mirrored their hunger, mirrored the ache in his own chest, that long, frozen loneliness sharpened by years of solitude in this valley. A flicker of firelight danced on the cabin's worn timbers as he knelt, voice swallowed by the roar of thunder, extending hands that trembled as much from cold as uncertainty. Lightning split again, closer this time, and the valley seemed to hold its breath. Every instinct screamed caution. Food was scarce, winter relentless, and shelter barely enough for one. Yet in the flickering half-light, the desperation in their eyes spoke louder than fear. Hunger was not patient. It would not wait for prudence. The first 20 seconds of recognition burned a paradox into his mind. Human kindness entangled with the fury of nature, a choice to be made while the storm raged around him. He gathered them with careful movements, the younger sister trembling against his chest, mud dripping from hair, eyes wide with a fragile trust. The older sister clutched a broken wheel, spoke as though it were a shield, hesitant, wary, yet drawn by his calm presence. Lightning illuminated their faces again, stark, gaunt, reminding him of ghosts he had long buried. Faces from his own childhood, hollowed by hunger, softened by the rare warmth of hands reaching out. Rain hammered down, a relentless drumbeat drowning thoughts, drowning reason, leaving only instinct, act, or leave them to the fury that would not forgive. He opened the cabin door, and a gust of wind surged inside, carrying the smell of wet earth, pine, and the bitter taste of the storm. He stepped aside, letting them inside. The fire sputtered to life as if in relief, shadows dancing across their emaciated forms. In that moment, the valley, drenched and wild, held a pause. Desperation met courage, and the air itself seemed to sigh at the fragile mercy offered. The storm did not relent, yet within the small cabin, a flicker of warmth began to take root. He tore strips of cloth from his own coat, wrapping them around the shivering girls, careful not to burn the fragile glow of trust now kindling in their eyes. Each movement, each gesture, was a quiet rebellion against the storm, against solitude, against the cruel calculus of survival. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, heartbeats matched the flicker of firelight, an orchestra of hope daring to rise above the thunder. A distant crack of rolling thunder reminded him that nature was indifferent, that every act of kindness carried its own peril. Yet as he handed a piece of bread, soaked and crumbling, into the older sister's trembling hands, he felt the first weight lift from his chest. Empathy, raw and dangerous, now shared space with necessity. He did not speak, for words would fall short against the storm's roar, but his eyes held a promise. Here, in the mud and rain, survival would not come at the cost of humanity. Lightning forked again, catching the cabin in a brilliant flash, revealing the valley's twisted, wet bones, fallen trees, swollen creeks, and the endless mud stretching to the horizon. Yet within the glow, two sisters, fragile yet alive, huddled under his care. The storm might rage, the world might bite, but in this fleeting crucible of fear and courage, A seed of trust had been sown, and as thunder rolled like distant drums of war, he realized that every choice from this moment onward would carry the weight of more than his own survival. The rain eased, though only slightly, like a sigh through the valley, leaving the mud glistening under the bruised gray sky. Inside the cabin, the flickering fire threw long shadows across the wooden walls, revealing every crack, every knot, every scar of years spent weathering the world. The sisters huddled close, their bodies trembling less as warmth seeped into their bones. But their eyes never left him, wary yet seeking refuge. He moved quietly, gathering bowls of water from the well outside, the rope slick in his hands, water dripping onto the floorboards, carrying with it the taste of earth and cold. Each step was measured, each gesture deliberate. The older sister flinched at the creak of the floor, the younger one clinging to her skirt, both haunted by memories he could only imagine. And yet, in their presence, the cabin no longer felt empty. Their fragile trust filled the air, a tension balanced on the edge of hope and fear. He tore meat from the last ration he had stored, dry and tough, the taste of iron lingering on his fingers. Feeding them was an act that both scared and steadied him. Every bite they took reminded him of the choice he had made, the gamble against fate. Outside, the wind rattled the walls, whipping the rain into sheets across the roof. Yet inside, for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe without the weight of solitude pressing down. The storm muttered on, distant rumbles echoing through the valley, but in the small cabin, life had returned to a fragile rhythm. He noticed the sisters' eyes, bright with curiosity now, scanning the rough, hewn interior, the tools hanging from walls, the hearth that promised warmth. He realized then that the valley was more than mud, wind, and rain. It was a crucible, and this night, this storm had forged a fragile alliance, binding their fates in the soft, flickering light. Lightning flashed again, though tempered now, reflecting off the wet window panes. He caught the older sister staring at the horizon, eyes wide, almost questioning, almost pleading. He understood without words, danger was not done with them. Somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the roar of the storm, forces stirred. But for now they were safe, and the choice he had made had carved a space for humanity to survive amid chaos. He settled near the fire, back aching, hands still muddy and worn, yet a small, stubborn pride bloomed. The sisters whispered to each other softly, the sound almost lost beneath the patter of rain, yet it filled the cabin with fragile music. He allowed himself to listen, to imagine a moment where survival was not only measured by food or shelter, but by trust, by mercy, by courage. The storm would return, he knew, and the valley would challenge them again, but tonight he had chosen differently. Night pressed against the cabin walls, black and heavy, the storm muttering like a distant predator. Yet inside, two sisters lay warm and fed, eyes finally closing, exhausted, and he watched over them with a quiet vigilance. Each heartbeat was a vow, each breath a promise. The valley might be cruel, the world merciless, but within these walls, compassion had taken root. And so the storm raged outside, but inside, a fragile hearth burned steady. Mud clung to boots, hair dripped from every edge of the cabin, and the wind whined through cracks in the walls. But courage had found a foothold in the heart of desperation. The night was long, the world still vast and wild, yet for a fleeting, precious moment, survival had chosen kindness over solitude, mercy over fear, and trust over despair. The storm had passed, leaving the valley slick and glistening under a sullen dawn. Mist clung stubbornly to the hills, curling around gnarled trees and pooling in the hollows like ghostly water. The cabin exhaled smoke from the hearth, a thin ribbon of warmth that mingled with the damp chill of morning. He sat alone for a moment, watching the sisters sleep, their faces softened by rest, and for the first time in years, silence wrapped him without accusation. The weight of the past pressed on him like the heavy fog outside. Memories unfurled unbidden, a family long gone, the barren fields that once promised life, and the harsh hands of winter that took more than crops ever could. He traced the scars on his own hands, roughened by labor and by loss, each one a story of survival etched into skin and sinew. He remembered hunger, the gnawing emptiness of childhood, the bitter taste of bread rationed to the last crumb, the ache of shoulders too young to carry the weight of necessity. The sisters stirred, small movements that tugged him back to the present. Their trust, tentative yet unspoken, mirrored the bonds he had once known and lost. He felt the ache of loneliness sharper now, sharpened by the recognition that connection was always fleeting, always fragile. The valley, gray and shrouded in mist, seemed to reflect the inner landscape of his own heart, vast, lonely, beautiful in its isolation, but haunted by what had been forsaken. Through the open window, the wind whispered over the hills, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. He allowed himself a moment to breathe it in, to measure the cost of solitude, and to feel the stirring of something long dormant, empathy. He glanced at the older sister, hair clinging to her pale cheeks, and the younger, fingers curling around her sister's sleeve. Hunger had been their enemy, fear a constant companion, and yet here they were, alive, fragile, and trusting. Memories rose like storm clouds behind his eyes. The fields that had failed, the crops that had withered in sun and frost, the nights spent counting stars and ghosts alike, all led to this quiet, suspended moment in the cabin. He understood then that survival had never been a matter of strength alone. It was courage, it was mercy, it was the willingness to reach out when the world had taught him to pull away. The fire flickered, sending long shadows across the walls, highlighting tools of labor and years of quiet struggle. He ran a hand along the worn beams, imagining the generations of hands that had gripped them before his own. Each mark, each dent, was a testament to endurance, to lessons learned in silence, to the moral weight of choices made in isolation. And now, these two fragile figures sleeping under his roof, he faced a new lesson, the cost of compassion in a world that had taught him only caution. The mist outside thickened, swallowing the ridges and low valleys in a gray embrace. He felt the pulse of the valley, its rhythm slow and deliberate, matching the cadence of memory and reflection. He thought of family lost, of roads untaken, of the faces of those who had depended on him once and no longer existed. Yet within this quiet, he also recognized possibility. The sisters' eyes would open soon, and with them, the fragile promise of trust, of moral choice renewed. Each heartbeat, each breath, was measured against the silent testimony of the past. He knew the valley would not forgive hesitation, that the world outside the cabin waited with sharp teeth and impatient wind. But here, for this brief span, he could anchor himself in something that mattered, the quiet, difficult, relentless act of caring, even when it carried risk. And as dawn struggled through the mist, casting a pale light across damp earth and sleeping forms, he resolved in silence that this moment, this fragile, trembling alliance, was worth every cost the world might demand. The mist lingered like a veil over the valley, softening the jagged edges of the hills, but it could not soften the memories pressing against him. He stirred from his vigil by the fire, watching the sisters awaken, their eyes adjusting to the dim light, fragile curiosity, replacing the raw hunger of hours before. The older sister's glance met his, tentative yet searching, and the younger clutched at her sleeve, a silent plea for safety, for warmth, for something steady in a world that had shown her little mercy. He moved with quiet precision, offering bread soaked in water, each crumb an act of defiance against the unforgiving valley outside. As they ate, the cabin seemed to grow smaller and larger at once, its walls containing not just their bodies but the weight of his own regrets. Every crack in the timber whispered stories of loss, nights spent counting failures, the ache of emptiness in a house that had once rung with laughter, the relentless teaching of nature that survival was often cruel, solitary, and exacting. His mind wandered to the seasons he had endured alone. The scorching sun of summer that cracked the earth beneath his boots. The cold bite of winter that gnawed through wool and sinew alike. He had learned to measure life by water in the well, by the yield of soil, by the steadiness of his own pulse against hunger. And yet, looking at the sisters now, he understood that life was measured not only by survival but by courage. The courage to act when the world had long taught him to withdraw. The older sister whispered a question, small and tremulous, about food, about shelter, about the roads that had led them here. He answered with gestures, with the warmth of hands and the steadiness of presence, words unnecessary. The younger sister's eyes followed every movement, wide and absorbing, reflecting a trust that was fragile yet profound. He realized then that empathy was a currency the valley did not honor, that mercy was a choice, and that fear, though constant, could be tempered by the courage to hold fast to humanity. Outside, the fog shifted, curling along the low ridges, carrying with it the scent of pine and mud, of rain still clinging to soil and rock. He remembered faces lost to time, friends and kin whose absence had hollowed the days, and he allowed himself to feel the echo of those losses now, not as a weight to bear alone, but as a bridge to the sisters. Their presence demanded more than provision. It demanded moral reckoning, a courage deeper than survival, a willingness to bind his fate to theirs against a world that would not pause to care. The cabin hummed with quiet life, the crackle of fire, the scrape of boots against boards, the low murmurs of questions and answers unspoken. He moved to mend a torn blanket, stitching it with care as he watched them settle near the hearth. Each thread was a promise, each gesture a silent acknowledgement that trust, once offered, carried a responsibility heavier than any burden the valley could impose. In the stillness between heartbeats, he sensed the valley itself holding its breath. Mist hung like a curtain over the rolling hills, the distant creek murmured beneath rocks and fallen branches, and the wind whispered through skeletal trees. The storm had passed, but the lessons of survival lingered, etched into mud and memory alike. And in this quiet dawn, he understood that the past was not a shackle to bind him, but a mirror, showing him that the courage to act, the strength to care, and the willingness to open one's heart to those in need were the true measure of life in a world that demanded both resilience and mercy. The sisters' breathing deepened, sleep returning, as their small bodies absorbed warmth and sustenance. He stood by the window, eyes tracing the misty horizon, feeling the valley's pulse beneath mud and stone. Regret and loneliness, so long companions, now tempered by purpose. Compassion had taken root in the midst of his isolation, and the valley, once indifferent, seemed to hum with a quiet acknowledgement of his choice. As dawn stretched its pale fingers across the misty hills, he allowed himself one small, steady thought. The world may demand cruelty, the valley may test every ounce of strength, but in this moment, in this fragile cabin, courage had chosen to rise, not in battle, not in survival alone, but in mercy and trust, in the quiet, relentless act of opening one's heart. The mist lifted slowly, revealing the valley's contours in muted shades of green and gray, the hills rolling like ancient waves frozen in stone. A wind rose from the east, rustling dry grass and carrying the faint scent of smoke and distant hooves. The rancher stood at the cabin door, watching the horizon, feeling the subtle shift in the air. The valley had changed overnight, and so had the balance of quiet he had fought to preserve. The sisters stirred, drawn to the edge of the cabin like fledglings sensing an approaching storm. Their eyes scanned the valley, sharp and wary, reflecting the tension that had settled between them and the world. Something was coming. He could feel it in the tremor of the air, in the rhythmic beat beneath his feet, in the distant murmur of motion across hills. He had lived long enough in these lands to know the difference between wind and warning, between silence and the soft rumble of approaching danger. A shadow moved along the ridge, dark against the streaked light of morning. The sisters gasped softly, instinctively retreating behind him. Their father, no, too swift, too deliberate, a rider alone, weaving through the valleys with purpose. Hooves beat a steady rhythm into the earth, echoing faintly against rock and hollow creek beds. The stranger's presence carried a weight of both threat and possibility, a balance delicate as the mist hanging over the hills. The older sister whispered a question, lips barely moving, about who might come, about whether they could trust the figure in the distance. The rancher said nothing, only observed the way the horse moved, the tilt of its rider, the subtle flare of color against the gray horizon. Experience told him this was no aimless wanderer. There was intent here, and the valley, patient and ancient, had delivered a messenger that would demand attention. He motioned the sisters back inside, close to the hearth, eyes following the stranger through the open doorway. Lightning from the storm days before had left the earth saturated, and each step of the horse splashed small arcs of mud into the air, shimmering faintly in the muted sunlight. The stranger paused at the crest of the ridge, scanning, calculating, silent as the valley itself. Suspicion tightened in the rancher's chest, yet there was also intrigue, the hint of someone who could change the fragile equilibrium of their morning, someone whose choices might intertwine with theirs in ways the valley had long anticipated. Inside, the sisters clung to each other, voices low, a mixture of fear and hope. The younger one's fingers brushed the older's, an unspoken pact of trust and caution. The older sister's eyes never left the ridge, following every motion of the rider. He studied them in return, silent and poised, carrying the weight of purpose that even the wind seemed to respect. In their presence, the valley's natural rhythm, the creak of timber, the distant murmur of a creek, the shiver of leaves, became a backdrop to suspense, a living, breathing canvas of anticipation. The rancher's hand lingered on the doorframe, fingers curling around rough wood, grounding himself in both reality and reflection. He had faced storms of nature and storms of memory, but this, the silent approach of an unknown force, was different. It carried the possibility of protection or peril, and in its quiet, measured pace, it held the power to shift the fragile bonds he had begun to forge with the sisters. The stranger moved again, descending the slope with measured calm, horse's hooves catching the morning light in brief flashes. Dust rose in small clouds, glittering like fragile sparks in the soft dawn. The sisters' breathing quickened, and the rancher felt the pulse of tension mirror his own heartbeat. Every instinct screamed caution, yet curiosity pulled him forward, toward knowledge, toward understanding, toward the inevitable confrontation that would redefine the valley, the cabin, and their fragile sanctuary. As the stranger drew closer, the wind carried faint words, the sound of leather shifting, reins tightening. The valley seemed to hold its breath, and in the cabin, a fragile calm met the encroaching storm. Here, at the edge of understanding and fear, the first threads of intrigue were woven. Suspicion, the possibility of aid, the shadow of danger, all coalescing into a moment that would stretch the valley's time, fold past and present into a single pulse of anticipation. He stepped back, allowing space for the sisters to see without exposing himself, and waited. The stranger was coming, and with him the valley would no longer be quiet. The first ripple of tension, subtle and precise, had arrived, and the cabin, huddled amid mist and mud, would soon bear witness to a convergence of fate that neither rain nor memory could have foretold. The stranger reached the base of the ridge, horse hooves slapping wet earth, mud flying in tiny arcs. He paused, surveying the valley with eyes sharp as flint, calculating, weighing, reading the land as though it spoke in whispers meant only for him. The rancher's hand stayed on the doorframe, fingers pressing into rough wood, steadying his own pulse as the sisters pressed close behind him. Their wide eyes mirrored the tension hanging like fog outside, uncertain whether hope or danger had arrived. The stranger dismounted with deliberate care, leather creaking, boots sinking slightly into mud. He moved with a grace born of necessity, body poised, eyes alert, a figure carved from the valley itself. A glint of sunlight caught a badge, a clasp, or perhaps simply the worn metal of a belt, something unfamiliar, something that spoke of authority or at least of command. The older sister's breath caught, and the younger tightened her grip on the other's sleeve, small fingers trembling with instinctive caution. The rancher stepped aside, letting the stranger's gaze sweep over the cabin, over the three forms huddled near the fire. No words were spoken, and yet communication flowed in a silent stream, eyes meeting eyes, posture shifting, the subtle language of survival and intent. The stranger's presence was a disruption, a ripple through the fragile calm of dawn, yet it carried with it a peculiar promise. Perhaps protection, perhaps peril. The valley had a way of testing both simultaneously. Wind rose again, carrying with it the faint scent of horses and distant smoke, tugging at the damp hair of the sisters, fluttering the edges of their clothing. The stranger's hand brushed against the reins as he moved closer, boots crunching against mud, and the air seemed to thrum with unspoken questions. Who was he? What claim did he carry across this gray expanse of valley, mist, and memory? And what would his arrival demand of the fragile trust slowly taking root within the cabin? The older sister whispered something, barely audible, but the rancher caught it, a hint of fear and longing woven together. She spoke of a protector, someone who might shelter them, yet her voice trembled with caution, the memory of absent guardians heavy in her tone. The younger sister shivered, both from cold and from the tension radiating from the stranger's measured movements. He had seen it before, those who approached with unknown intent, bringing the possibility of salvation or confrontation, their every step a negotiation with fate. The stranger finally stopped just beyond the porch, eyes sweeping the interior, lingering on the sisters' faces. The rancher held his own gaze steady, not flinching, not yielding, but neither antagonizing. There was a rhythm to this dance, an unspoken understanding that power and vulnerability shared the same space, that mercy could coexist with caution, that trust might be earned, slowly, carefully, like the soft drip of rain into a waiting creek. A sudden shift of wind rattled the cabin door, sending a spray of rain from the roof onto the porch. The sisters flinched. The stranger's eyes followed the movement, sharp, calculating. His presence was a question posed to the valley itself. Would it permit this fragile alliance, or rend it apart with the weight of forces unseen? The rancher's pulse thumped in his ears, steady yet alert, heart and mind aligned with the rhythm of the approaching tension. And then, without a word, the stranger dismounted fully, boots sinking into mud, horse pawing lightly as if sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. He approached the cabin, each step deliberate, measured, carrying the weight of someone who had walked countless miles through dust and shadow, through storms and silence alike. The sisters held their breath, leaning into the rancher's side, and the valley, vast and patient, seemed to wait as well, holding its breath along with them. The first threads of dialogue, or perhaps simply recognition, hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable. Suspicion, curiosity, hope, and fear blended in a fragile swirl, a cinematic tension that the valley itself seemed to honor. The stranger's presence was no longer merely a ripple. It was the first wave of a tide, hinting at revelations, confrontations, and the inevitable entanglement of fates. In that moment, with mist curling over hills and mud clinging to boots, the rancher understood the truth of the valley's lesson. No act of kindness exists in isolation. Every choice resonates, every gesture carries consequence, and every visitor, friend, stranger, or threater, arrives with a story that demands attention. The quiet of dawn was over. The valley had shifted, and with it, the fragile calm within the cabin would be tested in ways the storm outside had never demanded. Rain began again, thin at first, a whisper against the cabin roof, then thickening into a drumming insistence, beating against the earth, against timber, against the fragile heartbeat of the valley. The mist rose in swirling sheets, folding the hills into gray ghosts, and inside, the cabin felt both sanctuary and cage. The sisters huddled closer, their small forms trembling not only from the cold, but from the unspoken tension that had settled like a shadow over the room. He stood at the threshold, watching the storm lash the valley, listening to the wind scream through the skeletal trees. Every instinct cried caution. The valley offered no mercy to those who risked too much, and yet, in the sisters' faces, in the hollowing fear and the fragile trust, he felt the undeniable pull of moral duty. Their hunger was not polite, it demanded action. Their vulnerability pressed against the walls of the cabin like the storm pressing against the roof, and he knew in the marrow of his bones that tonight choice was not a luxury, it was necessity. The older sister's eyes met his, wide, pleading, silently asking the question he could not answer with words. Will you protect us? The younger clung to her sister, small fingers clutching at damp fabric, body trembling as if the storm outside had seeped into her very bones. He felt the weight of centuries of survival pressing down, the old lessons of solitude, the hard, one certainty that kindness could be a risk as deadly as exposure. Yet standing there, amidst wind, rain, and the hush of expectation, he understood that mercy once withheld could not be reclaimed. Thunder rumbled across the valley, low and rolling, echoing the tension tightening in his chest. The wind tugged at his coat, tugged at his resolve, and yet he moved toward the hearth, kneeling to stir the fire into life, letting warmth bleed into the cabin's corners, letting light chase shadows across their faces. Every movement was deliberate, each act a small rebellion against the storm, against isolation, against the instinct to preserve himself above all else. He laid out blankets, tattered but dry, and guided the sisters onto them, their small bodies curling like fragile shadows into the warmth. The older's fingers traced the lines in the wood floor, the younger's thumb brushed against her lips in quiet contemplation. He offered food, sparse but sufficient, and as they ate, the storm's fury outside became a rhythm to measure courage against. Each bite, each shiver soothed, each glance toward the door became an unspoken negotiation. Survival weighed against compassion, fear measured against honor. The cabin walls, soaked and trembling under the wind's assault, became a crucible. He could feel the valley itself leaning close, patient and indifferent, watching as human choice played out in its shadow. One decision would ripple beyond these walls, beyond this storm, beyond this valley. To turn them away would preserve him, preserve the comfort of solitude, preserve a life measured in cautious increments. To shelter them, feed them, risk his own safety. This was the gamble the storm had demanded. Outside, lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the skeletal trees, the churned mud, the relentless sheets of rain. Each flash was a reminder that danger was not theoretical. It was immediate. The valley had no patience for indecision. Yet within the cabin, warmth and light, however fragile, allowed him a moment to consider the truth he had avoided for years. Courage was not born of strength alone, but of willingness to act when the world offered no guarantee, when fear pressed against your chest and demanded retreat. The sisters looked at him, and he saw the reflection of what he once was, vulnerable, uncertain, in need of protection and guidance. Their lives now intertwined with his. The choice he made would define not just survival, but honor, compassion, and the measure of a man's heart against the impartial fury of the valley. Thunder rolled again, closer, sharper, and with it came clarity. To open his cabin to them, to face the storm outside and the storm within, was not optional. It was inevitable. He stepped aside from the doorway, letting them huddle near the fire, wrapping blankets around their shoulders. The rain hammered the roof, wind bent the trees, and the valley roared its approval or its warning. It was impossible to tell which. He simply acted, letting warmth, sustenance, and trust flow where fear had dominated. In that moment, the storm became both mirror and measure, reflecting the choice he had made, to embrace risk for the sake of compassion, to defy solitude in favor of humanity, to meet the fury of the valley with the steady pulse of moral courage. The storm surged with renewed fury, rain hammering the roof in relentless sheets, wind tearing at the cabin walls, rattling timber and shutter alike. Outside, the valley seemed to writhe under the tempest, each tree bending like a bowstring, each creek swollen with urgency. Inside, the warmth of the fire clung to the sisters' faces, softening fear, yet the tension remained, a taut cord strung between survival and moral courage. He moved from the hearth to the doorway, peering into the gray deluge, mud sucking at his boots, water running in rivulets down the slope. The valley tested him, as it always did. No mercy, no warning, only the brutal clarity of choice. His gaze shifted to the sisters, their trust, delicate as the thin blankets wrapped around them, weighed heavier than the storm itself. To turn away now would be to betray everything he had learned, everything he had survived for. To act was to court danger, to invite the wrath of nature, perhaps even of men, into the fragile cabin. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in stark white, then black again, a rhythm that mirrored the quickening pulse in his chest. He knelt beside the older sister, brushing damp hair from her face, letting her feel the steadiness of his hand. She met his gaze with an understanding beyond words, the smallest nod acknowledging the shared peril and shared hope. The younger one watched, eyes wide, chest rising and falling with tentative relief, her small fingers gripping the corner of her sister's blanket. Thunder rolled, vibrating through the cabin floor, and in that vibration he sensed the imminence of consequence. Somewhere beyond the ridge, unknown eyes might watch, and every act of kindness carried with it a risk measured not in days but in lifetimes. He placed a bowl of water before them, the reflection of the fire dancing across the liquid, a fragile mirror of hope in a world that demanded caution above all else. He fed them silently, each bite a quiet defiance against fear, a deliberate choice to prioritize courage over comfort. The storm beat against the valley with fury, but inside he moved with precision and care, closing windows, securing the door, stacking firewood, preparing for whatever the tempest might deliver. His mind measured risks as instinct and moral weight intertwined. Every gust of wind, every crack of thunder reminded him that choice had consequences, yet the act of sheltering the sisters had become more than obligation. It was an affirmation of something he had long denied, that compassion, even in the harshest crucible, was strength. Outside, water surged down the slopes, mud swallowing trails, yet he stood at the threshold, looking out, feeling the pulse of the valley beneath his boots. The storm was relentless, yet so too was the human heart when tested. He understood the truth that no previous hardship had taught. Courage was not merely surviving the storm, it was opening oneself to the needs of others in the midst of it. Each action, each heartbeat, each measured breath became a statement of defiance against indifference. He returned to the sisters, settling beside them, the firelight casting their shadows against the wall. Their small hands rested in his, their bodies warm, their eyes softened by the recognition of safety. Outside, wind tore at the cabin, rain pounded the valley, and yet inside, a quiet heroism had taken root, a resolve to act, to protect, to honor life and trust in equal measure. The storm would not end with nightfall, the valley would test them further. But in this moment, in this cabin battered by rain and wind, the choice had been made. He had opened his door, risked his safety, and embraced the responsibility that came with trust. The sisters were safe, for now, and the valley had witnessed the first act of courage that would shape every moment yet to come. As lightning flashed one last time across the horizon, illuminating mud, slicked hills and drenched timber, he felt the weight lift, not of the storm, not of danger, but of having chosen rightly. The valley was indifferent, the night still long, but human heart, when resolved, could stand steadfast amidst the fury. Morning arrived in shards of gold and gray, slipping through the cabin's cracks and dust-laden corners. The storm had departed, leaving the valley slick and glimmering, the earth steaming with release. Light filtered across the rough boards, highlighting splinters and scratches, each mark a testament to years of struggle, labor, and quiet survival. The sisters stirred, stretching into the warmth of the fire and sunlight, their eyes cautious, measuring, carrying the lingering shadows of past hardships. He watched them seated across from the hearth, observing their gestures, the older one tracing faint lines in the floor with a fingertip, the younger picking at the frayed edge of a blanket. Their movements were small and deliberate, yet to him they spoke volumes. Here were traces of fear, yes, but also resilience, hidden beneath layers of fragility. In the valley's quiet aftermath, secrets seemed to settle like dust, small motes suspended in the shafts of light, waiting to be revealed. The older sister spoke first, voice soft yet deliberate, weaving fragments of story into the warmth of the cabin. Their family, she explained, carried weight beyond mere survival, grudges, obligations, a history intertwined with vengeance and honor. She spoke of a father whose reputation stretched across ridges and rivers, a figure both respected and feared, whose wrath could rival the storms themselves. Every word pressed upon him a subtle warning. Their lives were not merely accidents of hunger and wandering. They were tied to forces vast and unyielding. The younger sister added little, but her silence was no less revealing. Each glance, each hesitant movement, betrayed understanding beyond her years. She clutched the older's hand, anchoring herself to a thread of trust, a lifeline in the uncertain web of their story. And in the flickering firelight, the rancher saw more than vulnerability. He saw a legacy, survival etched into flesh and memory, a history written in quiet endurance and silent sacrifice. Dust clung to the cabin's corners, caught in the rays of the morning sun, each particle suspended as if waiting to bear witness. The sisters' voices revealed fragments, journeys through harsh terrain, encounters with strangers and friends alike, small betrayals and moments of mercy that had preserved life against impossible odds. The valley outside seemed to listen, wind rustling through skeletal branches, creek water murmuring over rocks, as though nature itself acknowledged the unveiling of human history and moral complexity. He absorbed every word with careful attention, mind tracing the invisible threads connecting past and present. Each secret carried weight, each revelation a test of trust, each story a challenge to the fragile calm of the cabin. He realized that their survival depended not only on shelter and food, but on understanding, on discretion, on the quiet courage required to navigate the invisible currents of human loyalty and vengeance. The older sister paused, eyes glistening with unshed tears, revealing a moment of hesitation that spoke louder than any confession. Her words faltered, hinting at betrayal within her own family, at debts owed and consequences long deferred. The younger one shifted closer, absorbing the weight, and the rancher felt the valley's tension echoing in his chest. The storm outside had ended, but another tempest, the storm of secrets, of moral reckoning, of history pressing into the present, had just begun. He moved closer, sitting beside them, offering quiet gestures of understanding rather than questions. In the soft golden light, he saw the complexity of their world, not merely hunger, not merely flight, but a tapestry of survival, vengeance, and loyalty that demanded careful navigation. Each fragment of truth revealed added both clarity and burden, tying him further to the sisters' fate, binding his moral choice to theirs in ways that the valley, indifferent as ever, could only witness. Outside, the mist curled along the hills, soft and unthreatening for now, yet carrying a subtle reminder. The world beyond the cabin was patient, observant, and relentless. The sisters' secrets were only the first layer. Deeper truths awaited, and with them, challenges that would test courage, empathy, and moral fortitude. The valley, drenched and quiet after the storm, had shifted imperceptibly, preparing for the unfolding of conflicts that no fire, no walls, and no blankets could fully contain. As the firelight danced across their faces, the rancher understood the quiet, profound lesson of trust. Every revelation carried consequence, every act of disclosure demanded courage, and every bond formed in the shelter of compassion might be tested by the harsh, unyielding world outside. The morning passed, slow and deliberate, each heartbeat a reminder that survival was more than sustenance. It was understanding, vigilance, and the willingness to bear the weight of human complexity in a valley that judged only by consequence. The cabin seemed to breathe with quiet tension, the golden light fading to muted amber as dust motes floated lazily in the shrinking shafts of sunlight. The sisters sat close, their small bodies drawn together, shadows stretching across the rough floorboards, and in their faces the rancher saw a reflection of the valley's harsh truth. Resilience carved from hardship, loyalty tempered by fear, secrets weighed like stones in a river. The older sister's voice returned, softer this time, carrying confessions half-formed, the remnants of whispered warnings. Their father, she explained, was not merely a man of pride, but of justice as defined by a code older than the hills. The valley had raised him with its own uncompromising rules, and in those rules lay the weight of vengeance. Her words hinted at alliances and betrayals, old debts unpaid, and consequences that could ripple across ridges and rivers alike. Each fragment of truth was a seed of suspense, planting unease in the cabin's quiet warmth. The younger sister listened, wide-eyed, absorbing every word, while her hands twined in the older's lap, a silent gesture of solidarity. She had learned early that survival demanded attention, observation, and a careful weighing of the spoken and unspoken. The rancher watched this interaction, his mind cataloging each nuance, the tilt of a head, the flicker of an eye, the tremble in a lip. Every detail mattered. Every subtlety was a key to understanding the depth of the peril now brushing against their fragile sanctuary. Outside, the valley was a mirror of their revelations. The creek murmured insistently, carrying hints of distant movement. The wind, though gentle now, rustled the leaves with a subtle insistence, as if it too had absorbed the sisters' secrets and now sought to remind the world of them. He could feel the weight of impending confrontation pressing in, the subtle rhythms of fate coiling around the cabin, waiting for a moment to strike. And yet inside there was warmth, there was firelight, there was trust slowly knitting itself into the fabric of their shared refuge. The older sister paused, casting her gaze toward the shadows near the fire, and spoke of another truth, one that cut deeper, a warning of those who might come, riding through the valley with vengeance in their hearts. Their family's history was not merely story. It was a warning written in the sweat and blood of generations. The rancher's hands tightened subtly around the edge of the table. He understood that these revelations carried not just moral weight but imminent danger, and yet there was no retreat, no turning away. The cabin had become a crucible for courage and integrity, and he was committed to seeing it through. As the sisters continued to reveal fragments of their pasts, small, startling, intimate, they also revealed the depth of their fear, the precision with which they navigated a world that had shown them cruelty. Each story, each detail, was a brushstroke in a larger tableau of survival and consequence. The rancher absorbed it all, his mind weaving a tapestry of possibilities, calculating risk not as a measure of fear, but as a test of moral responsibility. The valley outside, patient and indifferent, seemed to wait, watching as the choices within the cabin began to echo beyond its walls. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, drawing their attention briefly outside. The creek glimmered silver in the fleeting sunlight, the hills shifting under the subtle sway of trees. The storm had passed, but the tension that now simmered was human in origin, secrets and history converging, hinting at challenges that would demand courage, wit, and the ability to navigate moral complexity. The rancher realized that the storm they had endured outside was nothing compared to the storm approaching within the valley of human consequence. He knelt again by the sisters, steadying them, offering reassurance not in words, but in presence. The older one leaned slightly against him, the younger curling into the older's side, and for a moment the cabin was a sanctuary not just of fire and timber, but of trust earned through courage and compassion. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. Secrets, once revealed, demanded action, and the valley beyond the cabin walls would soon require more than moral courage. It would demand strategy, foresight, and an unflinching heart. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, he allowed himself one small thought, anchored in the certainty of what had been shared. The sisters' truths were not merely stories. They were warnings, tests, and invitations. The valley, once again, would demand reckoning, and he, bound by the courage of his choice and the fragile trust of these two lives, would have to meet it. Dust settled, sunlight faded, and the cabin held its breath, a stage set for the next unfolding of human courage against the persistent weight of history. The valley trembled beneath a sky swollen with rolling clouds, dark and heavy, carrying a threat that no warmth of fire or cabin walls could fully dispel. The distant sound of hooves echoed faintly at first, irregular, almost lost in the whispering wind, but growing steadily, pounding through the mud, slicked earth, announcing the approach of inevitability. The rancher's chest tightened with anticipation, every sense alert, as if the valley itself had pressed a hand against his back, warning him of the collision to come. Inside the cabin, the sisters moved with quiet urgency, glancing toward the door, toward the windows, instinctively aware that their past was on the move, riding fast across hills and streams. Their fear was palpable, yet tempered by the cautious trust they had begun to place in him. The older one whispered fragments of what she remembered: names, faces, debts unpaid, anger as old and relentless as the land itself. The younger clutched the older's arm, small knuckles white with tension, while the rancher moved to the threshold, hands gripping the frame as his mind traced the approach of riders. The echo of distant thunder now mirrored in pounding hooves. The wind had picked up, rustling through skeletal branches, tugging at loose shingles, scattering leaves and debris across the valley floor. The storm outside, though absent of rain for now, was a mirror of the storm of human intent, wrath riding fast, unyielding, impossible to ignore. The rancher's gaze swept over the terrain, noting the rise of the ridges, the dips of the creek, every detail that might offer leverage, protection, or advantage. Survival now demanded both courage and calculation. Lightning flashed faintly along the horizon, revealing shapes moving in deliberate formation. Horses, riders, the silhouettes of men bound by honor, vengeance, and duty. The sisters flinched at each flash, and he placed a firm hand on the older one's shoulder, grounding them both. The distant thunder of hooves was a rhythm as old as the land itself, a signal that debts long deferred were arriving, and that the valley would witness the reckoning in full. He began preparations quietly, methodically, checking the sturdiness of doors, reinforcing weak panels, stacking firewood as potential barricades, and ensuring the warmth of the fire remained controlled, not as comfort alone, but as a source of vigilance. Each motion was deliberate, each breath measured. Fear was present, yes, but tempered by resolve. The valley demanded awareness, and he had learned long ago that panic only amplified danger. Calm observation, coupled with decisive action, was the only armor he could trust. The sisters huddled near the hearth, eyes wide, absorbing every shift in the cabin, every shadow cast by the firelight. The older whispered advice from memory, small strategies learned on the run, hints of the father's habits, the rhythm of his anger, the precision of his vengeance. The rancher absorbed every word, understanding that human cunning often matched or surpassed the fury of nature. The storm outside, the mud, slicked ridges, the flooded creek, all paled in comparison to the strategic weight of those who carried grudges across the valley. Rain began again, first as a whisper against the cabin, then a drumbeat in relentless insistence, and with it came the first real pulse of urgency. Hooves drummed faster, voices rose faintly, carried on the wind, the language of command and warning, the signal of confrontation imminent. The valley, once a quiet witness, now prepared for collision. He felt the inevitability press into the room with every gust, every shadow, every small tremor in the floorboards. The sisters leaned closer, drawing warmth, drawing courage, drawing reassurance from the steady presence beside them. The rancher knew this calm, however brief, was a fragile gift. Beyond the door, human intent moved like wildfire across dry grass, unstoppable, relentless. Their lives, tied now to his choice, would be tested by both honor and fury. Each sound, each flash of movement, each ripple of wind brought the valley closer to a confrontation that would demand not just courage, but the full measure of moral and strategic strength. Lightning struck nearer now, illuminating the valley floor, revealing the first true shapes of the approaching riders. Men on blackened horses, their silhouettes sharp, their intent unmistakable. The distant rhythm of hooves became a drumbeat of inevitability, and with it came the first taste of fear mingled with resolve. Survival would require more than shelter. It would demand action, decisiveness, and courage tempered by intelligence. The valley, soaked and breathing under the storm, seemed to wait for the moment when moral choice and human wrath would collide. He took a deep breath, steadying himself against the doorframe, letting his eyes sweep over the sisters, over the cabin, over the valley that had taught him the cost of every decision. The rising storm of men, riding fast and carrying the weight of family honor, would meet the quiet heroism of choice he had already made. And in that collision, in the roar of hooves, in the clash of intent and survival, the valley would bear witness to courage tested, trust defended, and human morality forged under pressure. The pounding of hooves grew louder, a relentless drum rolling across the valley, shaking the earth and rattling the cabin like a warning bell. Wind tore through the trees, bending trunks, tossing debris, scattering the last remnants of the storm, and carrying with it the faint but unmistakable scent of riders and dust. The valley, soaked from rain and thick with tension, held its breath, waiting for the collision of human will and moral courage that was about to unfold. Inside, the sisters pressed closer together, small hands gripping blankets, eyes wide with fear and anticipation. The older whispered fragments of strategy, what their father's men were likely to do, which paths they would take, where strength might falter. The younger one clutched her sister's sleeve, trembling but listening intently, her fear tempered by a growing understanding that the valley demanded vigilance, not panic. Every detail mattered, every movement a potential difference between survival and ruin. The rancher moved with calm precision, checking locks, reinforcing the door with slabs of timber, preparing for the inevitable. The fire flickered, throwing shadows across the cabin walls, shadows that seemed almost alive in the rising tension. Each flash of lightning from distant clouds illuminated the valley, revealing riders pushing through mud and underbrush, their black horses' hooves slicing through puddles, their voices rising in determined calls. The sound carried sharp and urgent, and the cabin seemed to shrink beneath it, the weight of imminent confrontation pressing against the walls. He stepped to the window, peering through a crack. The riders were close now, forming a semicircle around the valley floor, their movements precise, rehearsed, a predator's rhythm honed over years of discipline and honor-bound duty. The sisters watched silently, their trust in him anchoring them against the rising tide of fear. He met their eyes and offered no words, only steady presence, an unspoken promise that he would not falter. Outside, wind whipped mud across the valley, carrying echoes of hooves like the growl of an approaching storm. The rancher could feel the pulse of the valley in his bones, the resonance of fear mingling with determination, a rhythm that matched the pounding of his own heart. Every instinct urged caution, but experience and moral clarity demanded courage. He had chosen this path, opened his cabin to the sisters, and now the consequences had arriving not as abstract threat, but as tangible, living force. A flash of lightning revealed their father's figure atop a tall horse, silhouetted against the low clouds. He was the embodiment of authority, of ancestral justice, of wrath measured in decades. The valley seemed to shrink beneath his presence, as though the land itself recognized the weight of obligation, the gravity of the blood debt carried across generations. The riders halted in calculated positions, forming a ring, a theater of power and expectation, the tension palpable enough to press against the walls of the cabin. Inside, silence deepened, punctuated only by the rising wind and distant thunder of hooves. The sister's small hands remained in his, trembling but grounded. Every heartbeat was a measure of courage, every breath a conscious refusal to surrender to fear. The rancher's mind traced strategies and outcomes, yet he knew that this confrontation was not merely physical. It was moral, an opportunity to assert integrity, honor, and the quiet authority of choice against the thunderous assertion of inherited power. The first rider broke from the semicircle, moving closer, eyes sharp, scanning for weakness, hesitation, any signal that could be exploited. The older sister drew a deep breath, whispering a warning, and the rancher responded with calm, measured guidance, placing them in safer positions near the hearth while he assumed the line between defense and negotiation. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm of human will converging upon the cabin. The valley seemed to pulse with anticipation, the creek murmuring faster, the trees swaying violently, as though aware that the imminent clash would leave a mark beyond the physical, a test of courage, compassion, and moral strength. Every rider, every gesture, every tightened grip on reins and weapon was mirrored by the steady heartbeat of the rancher, the quiet trust of the sisters, the flickering light of the hearth, a counterbalance of humanity against raw force. The first shout rang out, sharp, demanding, a voice carrying both authority and warning. The valley echoed it, amplifying the tension, while the rancher stepped forward slightly, meeting the charge with presence, resolve, and unspoken command. The standoff was complete, a moment suspended in time, where honor, courage, and moral choice collided with history, obligation, and vengeance. The storm had arrived in human form, and now the valley bore witness to the rising tide of confrontation. Lightning flashed again, illuminating mud. Slicked horses, tense riders, the sisters' small faces turned toward him with trust and fear interwoven, and he realized fully. Courage was not the absence of fear, nor the avoidance of danger. It was the embrace of duty, compassion, and honor in the heart. Of a rising storm, every second mattered. Every decision would echo far beyond this cabin, beyond this valley, beyond the thunder of hooves and wind, defining not just survival, but the measure of the human spirit. The first light of dawn cut through ragged clouds, casting a blood-tinged hue across the valley, illuminating mud, slicked trails, and trembling treetops. The storm had spent itself, leaving the earth glistening, rivers swollen, and the air heavy with the scent of wet soil and iron. From the ridge above, the thrum of hooves grew steady, deliberate, a rhythm of inevitability, and the valley seemed to shrink beneath the weight of history pressing into the present. The rancher stepped outside, boots sinking into the soft mud, and surveyed the scene. The tribal father had arrived, mounted tall on a dark horse, flanked by riders whose eyes held the precision and ruthlessness of men who carried generations of honor and vengeance on their shoulders. They spread across the valley like shadows in motion, forming a semicircle, enclosing the cabin and the fragile sanctuary he had built. Every detail was calculated, disciplined, exact. Every motion carried the unspoken threat of retribution. Inside the cabin, the sisters clung to each other, their small forms pressed close, and he placed a steadying hand on the older one's shoulder, letting them draw strength from his presence. Words were unnecessary. The unyielding reality of the valley, the rising threat of human wrath, and the trust that had grown between them spoke volumes. They were tethered to him now, and he knew that courage alone would not suffice. Wisdom, diplomacy, and moral clarity would shape the path forward. The tribal father dismounted, boots sinking into the mud with a soft, deliberate rhythm. His eyes, dark and unflinching, scanned the cabin, the rancher, the sisters. There was no haste, no anger expressed through haste, only the slow, patient pressure of authority, a weight that could bend or break those who faltered. The riders remained mounted nearby, silent sentinels, their hands resting lightly on reins and weapons, ready to enforce the judgment of a father's code. The rancher remained where he stood, shoulders squared, gaze steady. He understood the stakes. These were not merely two girls or a single act of mercy. This was honor versus compassion, tradition versus conscience, the weight of generations confronting the quiet determination of one man who had chosen courage in the storm. He drew in a slow, deliberate breath, feeling the valley beneath his boots, the wind tugging at his coat, the distant mountains watching silently. Every heartbeat measured the moral ground he now claimed. The father spoke first, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the authority of lineage and expectation. The words were few, chosen, heavy with implication. The demand was clear. The girls must return, the debt must be paid, the code upheld. His gaze did not waver, and in that moment, the valley held still, listening, waiting for the response that would decide the shape of consequence. The rancher met his eyes evenly, offering no fear, no submission, only presence, only resolve. He spoke in measured tones, not as defiance, but as assertion of choice. He would not betray trust. He would not abandon courage. The words carried weight, slow and deliberate, resonating with the valley itself, as if nature acknowledged that moral integrity could stand against the roar of authority. The sisters pressed closer, silent witnesses to the standoff, their small bodies tense, hearts pounding in rhythm with the valley. Each rider shifted slightly, sensing the unspoken tension, the fragile equilibrium that balanced on the edge of violence. The mud beneath hooves squelched, the air held its breath, and the sun broke briefly through clouds, casting light on the tableau. A confrontation of wills, honor against honor, courage against consequence. The father's eyes flicked toward the sisters, then back to the rancher, searching for hesitation, for compromise, for weakness. The rancher, unmoving, held the moral high ground. He had offered shelter, protection, compassion, and now, faced with the weight of blood and history, he would not falter. Every muscle, every breath, every heartbeat resonated with the unshakable certainty of choice. The valley around them seemed to pulse, alive with the potential for conflict, with the shadow of violence brushing against the earth, but restrained, waiting for the signal that would release it. The rancher's gaze swept over the riders, taking measure, noting distance, strength, readiness. But more than that, he noted character, the human threads that could be appealed to even amidst the tension. This was not merely survival. It was negotiation with honor, a moral standoff where every word, every gesture, every second could tip the balance. The valley held its breath, the mud glistening in golden dawn light, the wind holding a whisper, the creek murmuring softly as though warning of the storm that could erupt at any moment. And in the center of it all, the rancher, steady and resolute, prepared to confront the reckoning that the storm outside had only foreshadowed. The valley seemed suspended in the crimson light of early morning, mud and mist merging into a haze that softened edges and sharpened tension. The tribal father stood tall, every line of his body radiating authority and restrained fury. His riders formed a ring, hooves sinking into the soaked earth, muscles taut, eyes unblinking. The air carried the scent of rain, iron, and anticipation, thick enough to taste. Every heartbeat resonated like a drum, counting down to a moment that could erupt into bloodshed or resolve. The rancher stepped forward, boots squelching in the mud, shoulders straight, eyes unflinching. He did not raise his voice, did not signal fear. His presence alone spoke of a quiet defiance born from moral certainty. He would not hand over the sisters, not out of stubbornness, but out of understanding that trust, once given, demanded protection. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and heavy with the weight of choice. The father's gaze flicked to the sisters, their small figures huddled together near the cabin, and then back to the rancher. He spoke again, slow, deliberate, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. Honor demanded compliance. History demanded action. The valley seemed to lean in, listening, the trees motionless, the creek's murmur hushed, all awaiting the response that would define the measure of courage and integrity in this confrontation. The rancher met the father's eyes evenly, letting the silence stretch for a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed. Then he spoke, calm and deliberate, each word chosen with precision. He would not betray trust. He would not abandon courage. He acknowledged the father's honor, the weight of his duty, and yet he drew a line between vengeance and morality, between inherited obligation and the lives of the innocent. The valley held its breath, the mud beneath them soaking in the resonance of conviction. A rider shifted, hooves squelching, hands resting lightly on reins, waiting for the signal of movement, the crack of command, the signal of violence. The wind carried a whisper, a subtle warning from the valley itself, rustling branches, tugging at clothing, carrying the scent of tension and rain. Every man there understood the stakes. Blood could be shed, but honor could also be preserved. The moral calculus of courage, compassion, and consequence stretched taut across the valley floor. The older sister stepped slightly forward, her voice small but steady, adding fragments of truth, offering clarity, revealing loyalty, and demonstrating the courage instilled by years of survival. The father's eyes narrowed, noting her bravery, noting her integrity, noting the bond between them and the man who had sheltered them. Even amidst the raw authority of tradition, recognition flickered. These were not merely girls, these were heirs to moral choice, and their courage was undeniable. The younger sister reached for the older, grounding herself, her gaze never leaving the rancher. Trust had been built in the shadows of the storm, in the quiet heat of the cabin's fire, in the unspoken promise that she would not be abandoned. That trust now radiated outward, visible to all who observed, pressing against the tension like light against dark. The father's jaw tightened, a flicker of internal calculation crossing his face. Respect, begrudging but present, for the man who had stood firm without striking, for the life he had chosen to protect over the dictates of simple compliance. Minutes stretched, the valley holding each second like a taut rope, ready to snap. The rancher's steady stance, the girl's quiet courage, and the father's measured restraint created a fragile equilibrium. No weapon had been drawn, no hoof had charged, yet the threat of violence lingered in every breath of wind, in every shifting shadow, in every heartbeat that echoed against the valley walls. Finally, the father took a slow step back, lowering the weight of immediate action without losing the authority of presence. His eyes met the rancher's once more, conveying recognition, the silent acknowledgement of courage and honor defended. The valley seemed to exhale as one, the tension softening but not disappearing. A quiet truce born of moral clarity rather than force. The riders shifted, hooves sinking into mud, waiting for further instruction, but the first edge of violence had passed, deferred by courage, choice, and unflinching human integrity. The sisters exhaled, relief mingling with lingering fear, and the rancher allowed himself the smallest gesture, a nod, a steadying hand on the older sister's shoulder. Trust had been tested, honor had been weighed, and in the crucible of confrontation, the valley had borne witness. Courage had prevailed, not in bloodshed, but in the quiet, resolute assertion of moral duty, in the defense of the innocent, and in the recognition that human choice could bend the course of even the most unyielding storm. The early light shifted again, golden now, brushing across mud and mist. illuminating the valley's scars and the resilience of those who had stood firm. The wind softened, the creek's murmur resumed its gentle cadence, and the riders, still present, accepted the balance struck, not through force, but through courage, honor, and unwavering integrity. The rancher, the sisters, and the valley itself had endured, each heartbeat echoing with the quiet triumph of moral reckoning. The first golden rays of sunrise filtered through dissipating storm clouds, spilling across the valley in broad, trembling beams that lit up the wet earth like liquid fire. Mud glistened underfoot, reflecting the fiery glow, while the creek whispered along its banks, carrying the remnants of the storm and the promise of a new day. The valley, once tense and wary, now seemed to breathe slowly, cautiously, as if acknowledging the fragile equilibrium that had been struck overnight. The rancher emerged from the cabin, boots heavy with mud, shoulders straight but no longer rigid with anticipation. The air carried the scent of damp pine and churned soil, and in that earthy perfume was a sense of renewal. The riders, still positioned along the ridges, shifted their stance, the weight of their horses' hooves less threatening, more measured. They had arrived with vengeance on their minds, but they now lingered with the respect earned by one man's quiet courage, the undeniable proof that honor could coexist with compassion. The sisters stepped out from the cabin, their small frames silhouetted against the golden light, their faces pale but resolute. They had survived the storm of both nature and human intent, and their eyes reflected gratitude, relief, and an emerging sense of safety. The rancher met their gaze, offering a steady nod rather than words. The language of trust and protection needed no voice here. The valley itself understood. The tribal father remained atop his horse, watching from the ridge, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. The fiery light caught the edges of his weathered features, highlighting a sternness softened by the grudging respect he now bore for the rancher. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The unspoken acknowledgement of bravery, moral clarity, and the courage to act in the service of others had been communicated. The blood debt, while unforgotten, was tempered by recognition of justice administered without unnecessary cruelty. The rancher walked slowly across the mud-slicked valley, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. Each step was deliberate, measured, an affirmation of presence and intent. He approached the sisters, extending a hand that spoke not just of protection, but of continuity, of human bonds forged in the crucible of challenge. The older sister reached for it first, her fingers closing around his with a quiet trust, while the younger clutched her sister's arm, their connection unbroken, resilient. Riders began to retreat gradually, spreading across the ridges with a rhythm that acknowledged the valley's new order. Their father followed, riding slowly, observing the rancher, the sisters, and the land itself. The golden sun illuminated the mud, streaked horses, the lingering puddles, and the valley floor, emphasizing that even after the storm, life persisted, shaped by courage, choice, and moral action. The rancher paused, taking in the valley as a whole, the creek winding like silver thread, the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze, the distant mountains holding their watchful silence. In this tableau, victory was quiet, understated, yet profound. Survival alone had never been the measure of triumph. It was the preservation of trust, the defense of innocence, and the assertion of honor that defined true success. The sisters moved closer to the rancher, their small forms framed by the golden light. The older one spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of gratitude and understanding. The valley had not only tested them, but had also revealed the possibilities of courage, integrity, and human decency. The younger sister nodded, her eyes reflecting the dawn, the firelight now replaced by the sun's clarity. Together, they represented both hope and resilience, the living testament to the power of protection and trust. From the ridge, the tribal father's gaze lingered, a silent acknowledgement that honor had been preserved. that justice had been served without needless bloodshed, and that the choices made in the valley had shifted the balance of human morality. The rider's presence began to recede, leaving the valley open, free yet still reverent, echoing with the memory of tension now transformed into respect. The rancher turned toward the creek, the sunlight dancing across rippling water, reflecting streaks of gold and silver. He knelt briefly, allowing himself a quiet moment to breathe in the valley, to feel the weight of danger past and the promise of safety gained. This was not triumph born of domination or force. It was the triumph of moral courage, the reward of standing steadfast in the face of threat, and the validation that compassion could bend the rigid structures of honor without breaking them. The valley, once dark and storm-tossed, now shimmered with potential. Every tree, every puddle, every ridge seemed to vibrate with renewed life, echoing the moral clarity and courage that had shaped the morning. And in that golden, glistening light, the rancher, the sisters, and the land itself recognized that justice had dawned, not loud, not violent, but steady, deliberate, and transformative. The golden sunlight spread further across the valley, washing over puddles and mud, transforming them into mirrors that reflected the quiet victory of the morning. The storm's fury had vanished, leaving only a world renewed, glistening, and aware of its own resilience. The air was crisp, scented with wet earth and pine, and the creek sang a gentle song, its waters carrying the memory of rain and the weight of choices made in courage. The rancher walked deliberately toward the sisters, his boots leaving deep impressions in the softened earth, each step a quiet assertion of stability in a world recently threatened by chaos. The older sister's eyes met his, gratitude and relief shining in the soft morning light. The younger clung to her sister, still tentative, still aware of the danger that had passed but the lessons that lingered. He knelt slightly, offering them reassurance not with words, but with presence, a solid, unwavering promise that they were safe. From the ridges above, the tribal father and his riders observed quietly. Their posture was relaxed yet dignified. Respect had replaced the edge of threat. He did not speak, yet his gaze acknowledged the truth the valley had revealed. The rancher's courage, the protection of innocence, and the balance of honor and compassion had not only prevented bloodshed, but had reshaped the way respect was measured. It was an unspoken truce, forged not in violence but in moral clarity. The sisters stepped fully into the open, their small figures illuminated by sunlight glinting on wet mud and foliage. Their movements were cautious but confident, guided by trust and the knowledge that the man who had sheltered them would not falter. The rancher extended a hand, and the older sister grasped it firmly, a connection that carried the weight of safety, gratitude, and shared endurance. The younger one followed, their bond unbroken, a living testament to courage preserved and innocence defended. The valley itself seemed to respond, as if nature recognized the moral equilibrium restored. Trees swayed gently in the warm breeze, leaves glistening with droplets of dew, the creek rippling softly, and birds beginning tentative songs that punctuated the calm. The once menacing mud and debris now sparkled like jewels in the sun, a visual echo of the triumph of moral courage over the threat of vengeance. The tribal father made a final, deliberate motion, signaling his riders to retreat. The men shifted, moving back across the ridges, their horses' hooves leaving the valley floor free. There was no malice left, only a grudging respect for the one who had stood firm, for the lives he had chosen to protect, and for the quiet heroism that had prevailed. The valley, once tense with anticipation of conflict, now radiated calm authority, the kind earned through courage and honor, not fear or force. The rancher remained near the sisters, watching as sunlight bathed the valley in full morning glory. Every rock, every puddle, every blade of grass shimmered with the memory of storm and the affirmation of moral triumph. He knew that survival alone was never enough. The measure of a man, of a day, of a storm endured, was how he met his moral duties, how he protected the vulnerable, and how he balanced courage with compassion. The sisters' laughter, soft, cautious, emerging like the first gentle song of the valley, reached his ears. Relief softened the lines of worry on their young faces, and the rancher felt the quiet warmth of connection, a reward for choices made in the shadow of danger. The valley had witnessed confrontation, reckoning, and restraint, and now it held the echoes of trust, courage, and restored honor. As the sun climbed higher, the rancher took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding himself in the rhythm of the morning. The creek gurgled along its course, the mud sparkled, and the air shimmered with the promise of peace. Justice had not been enforced by violence, but by courage and moral clarity. In the heart of the valley, in the aftermath of storm and confrontation, a new order emerged, quiet, steadfast, and luminous with the light of human integrity. The sisters moved closer, hand in hand, a living symbol of resilience and trust. The rancher's gaze swept across the valley, noting the beauty restored, the lives preserved, and the honor maintained. The day was no longer defined by fear or fury, but by the enduring truth that courage, compassion, and moral choice could transform the darkest hours into a golden dawn. The valley had settled into a fragile serenity, the storm now a memory etched into every puddle, every mud, crusted rock, every glistening leaf. Morning stretched lazily across the hills, soft mist rising from the creek and curling like smoke above the golden grass. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, carrying a quiet reminder of what had passed and what had been preserved. The tension of the previous night lingered only as a shadow, now softened by reflection and the slow rhythm of life returning. The rancher stood near the creek, watching the sisters move among the mud. Slicked ground, their movements careful but free. The older one bent to examine a puddle reflecting the rising sun, a small smile breaking across her face as the light danced like fire across the water. The younger mirrored her, stepping lightly, the weight of fear easing from her small shoulders. In their laughter, tentative but sincere, the rancher heard the echo of relief and the quiet music of survival secured by courage and honor. He walked slowly toward the cabin, boots leaving faint impressions in the damp earth. Each step was deliberate, a meditation on the past night's choices, the confrontation, and the fragile moral victories that had shaped it all. The storm had tested him, the tribal father had tested him, yet in the crucible of tension and threat, he had preserved life, defended trust, and upheld honor. The valley bore witness, every ripple in the creek and every rustle in the trees a silent testament to resilience and redemption. The sisters lingered near the doorway, their eyes following his movements. They had endured hunger, fear, and the weight of uncertainty, and now they stepped into a space defined not by threat, but by safety, by the quiet assertion of care that had been offered in the heart of chaos. The older sister's gaze met his briefly, a look heavy with unspoken gratitude and recognition of the courage that had guided him. The younger clung gently to her sister, her eyes bright, reflecting both relief and cautious hope. From the distant ridge, the tribal father observed the valley, his figure softened by morning haze. The riders had settled into their perimeters, calm yet watchful, the echo of authority lingering but no longer menacing. He had come seeking vengeance, expecting conflict, and found instead restraint, courage, and moral clarity. The acknowledgement in his gaze was subtle but unmistakable. Respect had been earned, not through domination, but through the steadfast protection of the vulnerable and the preservation of life in the face of threat. The rancher knelt briefly beside the creek, letting his fingers trail through the rippling water. The movement was small, meditative, grounding him to the valley that had tested and shaped him. Every ripple carried away a fraction of tension. Every reflection in the water mirrored the faces of the sisters, and in that mirror he saw not only their relief but the affirmation of the choices made. Life had been preserved, honor maintained, and trust rewarded. The valley seemed to exhale, a soft breeze carrying away the remnants of the storm. Birds took tentative flight, their wings cutting the golden light, their calls punctuating the stillness. The sisters laughed softly again, moving closer to the rancher, their steps careful but light, a dance of regained freedom and security. In that rhythm, the valley itself seemed alive with moral resonance, a reminder that courage tempered by compassion could transform fear into hope, confrontation into understanding. The rancher's gaze swept across the valley floor, every ridge, every tree, every puddle a reminder of the night's trials. He had faced the storm, the threat of vengeance, and the weight of moral decision. And in every breath of morning air, every glimmer of sunlight, he felt the quiet satisfaction of redemption, a debt paid not in blood, but in the steadfast defense of trust and life. The sisters' presence, small but resolute, mirrored the valley's own renewal, a living testament to the quiet power of honor fulfilled. As the mist lifted slowly, the rancher took a deep breath, the warmth of sunlight brushing his face. The storm had passed, the threat had receded. The valley, once tense and foreboding, now breathed a quiet song of redemption, survival, and trust restored. And in that song, he understood something profound. The aftermath of courage is not loud or grand, but quiet, reflective, and morally enduring. A lesson carried not just in memory, but in every choice yet to come. The sun climbed higher, casting long, warm shafts of light that gilded the valley in gold and amber. Mist lifted slowly from the creek, curling and dissolving into the morning air, revealing the full scope of a land washed clean by storm and marked by the passage of human courage. The valley, once tense and wary, now hummed softly with the rhythm of life restored, each leaf and ripple bearing witness to the choices that had shaped this day. The sisters moved freely now, their steps careful but confident, their laughter rising like a song that had been held too long in silence. The older one bent to examine wildflowers peeking through mud, brushing petals with tentative fingers, while the younger twirled in the shallow puddles, splashing lightly, delight breaking through the lingering traces of fear. Each gesture spoke of resilience, of trust regained, and of the deep relief of survival nurtured by courage and protection. The rancher walked among them, boots heavy in mud, hands brushing against reeds and wet grass, his eyes softening as he watched their cautious joy. He did not speak much, words were unnecessary, but the tilt of his head, the steady presence at their side, carried reassurance heavier than any spoken promise. He had stood firm through storm and threat, and now his reward was quiet. The sight of life preserved, trust honored, and innocence defended. From the distant ridge, the tribal father observed. He had come expecting confrontation, perhaps even bloodshed, yet he found none. Instead, he saw restraint, honor, and the quiet assertion of moral courage. His gaze softened, an acknowledgment passing silently through the space between him and the rancher. Respect, hard, earned, and reluctant, filled the distance. He had tested strength in the valley, and it had answered not with fury, but with integrity. The sisters approached the rancher, linking hands, the older gently guiding the younger. Their eyes met his, and in that glance was a universe of gratitude, relief, and trust. The rancher's gaze followed them as they moved, heart steady, absorbing the peace now settling over the land. The valley, once a theater of threat and anticipation, now embraced harmony, every tree, puddle, and ripple reflecting the quiet triumph of human choice and courage. The creek gurgled softly beside them, its waters reflecting sunlight like shards of gold. The rancher knelt briefly, allowing his fingers to ripple the water, letting the currents carry away the last traces of tension. The sisters watched, silent but attentive, learning from this quiet demonstration of connection, of patience, and of moral endurance. Even in silence, lessons were being passed, shaping trust into permanence. A soft breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and birds began tentative calls, filling the valley with gentle life. The sisters laughed again, moving closer to him, and the rancher allowed himself a small, rare smile. Relief mingled with quiet pride. The storm had tested every boundary of courage, fear, and duty, yet the outcome had been clear. Lives preserved, honor intact, and trust fortified. The tribal father and his riders began to withdraw, leaving the valley open and still, yet charged with the resonance of respect earned. The sun reflected off their departing silhouettes, golden and dignified, carrying away remnants of tension, yet leaving behind a powerful acknowledgement. Justice had been achieved without bloodshed, through courage, compassion, and steadfast moral choice. The rancher stood again, watching the sisters explore the valley's edges. Every small movement, every laugh, every glance toward the sunlight spoke of survival and renewal. He felt the weight of the valley, the memory of the storm, and the quiet pride of standing firm where it mattered most. Here, in the golden light of morning, he understood that redemption is not measured by spectacle, but by the lives touched, the trust preserved, and the courage demonstrated when the world demands it most. The valley, washed clean and bright under the climbing sun, seemed to hum a quiet benediction. Life, tested and tempered, flowed once more in gentle currents of hope and renewal. And in that soft, enduring glow, the rancher, the sisters, and even the distant observers from the ridge could feel it, the lasting power of moral courage, compassion, and the quiet redemption that follows when one stands unwavering in the defense of trust and life. The valley lay in silence beneath a wide, open sky. The hills bathed in the soft light of morning that stretched endlessly across the horizon. The creek flowed steadily, catching the sun in silver threads that danced over its rippling surface, a gentle hymn of continuity after the trials of storm and strife. The air smelled of wet grass and pine, warm under the touch of daylight, carrying a quiet calm that seemed almost sacred after nights of tension, mud, and moral reckoning. The rancher stood at the edge of his cabin, shoulders relaxed now, chest rising and falling in the unhurried rhythm of survival preserved and honor maintained. His gaze swept across the valley, taking in every ridge, every puddle, every tree swaying gently in the morning breeze. In the distance, the sisters moved freely, their laughter mingling with the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. Their steps were confident yet playful, embodying the safety and trust that had been earned through courage, restraint, and moral clarity. He watched them carefully, noting how the older sister led the younger through patches of wildflowers and puddles, her hand guiding and protecting, just as he had done. The younger one twirled arms wide, splashing lightly in the shallow water, her small face bright with joy and innocence restored. Every gesture, every movement was a reminder of what had been at stake, and what had been preserved not through might, but through deliberate choice and compassionate courage. The sun rose higher, spilling light across mud, streaked paths and shining off creek water like molten gold. Each reflection, each shimmer, mirrored the valley's transformation. From a place of tension, danger, and fear, to a realm defined by trust, safety, and quiet triumph. Even the trees seemed to sway in acknowledgement, leaves glinting with dew. Branches stretched skyward as if exhaling the memory of past storms. The rancher stepped forward, boots pressing into the softened earth, and felt the weight of the valley beneath him, the presence of life preserved, and the quiet triumph of moral clarity fulfilled. He had faced storms of both weather and human conflict, and had emerged not only unbroken, but strengthened by the choices he had made. The valley had taught a lesson in courage, in honor, and in the enduring power of compassion. From the distant ridge, the tribal father watched once more, his figure cast long and still in the morning sun. There was no threat now, only acknowledgement, a silent recognition that the balance of honor, trust, and courage had been restored. The riders had dispersed, leaving the valley to its quiet rhythm, a rhythm now shaped by protection, moral courage, and human resilience. The sisters, laughing and exploring at the valley's edge, moved together like threads of light through the golden landscape. The rancher's gaze followed them, steady and contemplative. He understood, in the deepest part of himself, that true courage was not measured by the storms one survived, or the threats one faced, but by the lives one chose to protect, the trust one chose to honor, and the moral clarity one carried into every action. He knelt briefly by the creek, letting his fingers trail in the water, rippling reflections of light and sky. Each ripple seemed to echo the lessons of the valley, the choices of the past hours, and the quiet, enduring triumph of human decency. The sisters came closer, drawn by instinct and trust, their small hands resting briefly on his, a silent affirmation of safety, gratitude, and the moral horizon now stretching before them. The valley breathed alive and serene. Every hill, every tree, every creek ripple carried the memory of struggle and the promise of renewal. The storm was behind them. The confrontation was behind them. What remained was the light of understanding, the affirmation of courage, and the quiet knowledge that honor, trust, and compassion were the true measure of survival. And in that expansive, sunlit valley, the rancher understood the enduring truth of all he had faced. That life, when preserved through courage and compassion, creates a horizon of moral clarity that stretches far beyond any storm, any confrontation, or any moment of fear. The sisters laughed, the creek sang, and the valley itself seemed to shimmer with quiet, eternal justice. The sun climbed fully above the valley, spilling warm light over the hills, the creek, and the scattered remnants of mud and debris that had once borne the weight of storm and fear. The sisters ran freely along the edges of the valley, their laughter bright and unrestrained, echoing against the hills in a melody of restored innocence. The older sister held the younger's hand, guiding her through puddles that reflected the sky's soft gold, teaching her the rhythm of trust and safety in a world once so threatening. The rancher stood quietly on a small rise overlooking them, shoulders relaxed, eyes tracing their movements. He felt the weight of the valley beneath him, the heavy burden of the choices made, the storm endured, the confrontation survived. And yet, more than weight, there was a lightness in knowing that the lives before him were safe, that trust had been honored, and that courage had carried the day not through violence, but through steadfast protection and moral clarity. Every detail of the valley seemed alive with acknowledgement. Leaves shimmered in the sun, the creek rippled in gentle waves, and the trees swayed with a quiet rhythm, whispering the memory of storm and the triumph of steadfast hearts. Even the distant ridges, once the looming stage of potential vengeance, now lay calm and welcoming, witnesses to the balance restored through courage and compassion. The sisters paused, glancing toward him, their eyes reflecting gratitude, relief, and wonder. Words were unnecessary. Their safety, their joy, their trust were affirmation enough of all he had done. The rancher breathed in the valley's morning air, letting the warmth fill him, anchoring the lessons learned, the moral debts honored, and the enduring truth of courage tempered by compassion. The tribal father and his riders had long since departed, leaving no trace of threat, only the acknowledgement of respect silently carved into the space between human hearts. Honor, it seemed, could be won without blood, and justice could rise from restraint rather than force. The valley, glistening under the full sun, bore witness to the quiet triumph of choice over fear, of integrity over intimidation, and of compassion over the cruelty that storms, both human and natural, so often leave in their wake. The sisters ran to the creek, their small feet splashing lightly, laughter mingling with the gentle babble of water and the whisper of wind through the grass. The rancher watched, still and steady, knowing that the measure of courage had always been more than survival. It was in the lives touched, the trust earned, and the moral clarity that outlasts every storm. He stepped closer, the soft earth giving beneath his boots, and extended a hand which the older sister took firmly, the younger following instinctively. In the quiet of the valley, in the golden warmth of the morning, the rancher understood the enduring truth of all that had passed. True courage is found not in solitude, nor in fear faced alone, but in the choices we make to protect, to honor, and to uphold life when it is most fragile. The storm had tested them all, yet it had revealed what was strongest. Not fists or fury, but steadfast hearts and moral resolve. The valley breathed around them, alive with sunlight, water, and wind. Every ridge, every puddle, every shimmering leaf reflected the subtle victory of lives preserved, trust restored, and honor maintained. The sisters' laughter echoed as a soft, unbroken hymn, carried across the land by the gentle wind, reminding all who listened that courage, compassion, and moral clarity endure longer than any storm, any fear, or any threat. And in that radiant morning, the rancher saw it clearly. Some debts are paid not with blood, but with the courage to face the dawn, to protect the vulnerable, and to stand unwavering in the quiet, enduring light of justice and honor.